Okay, let's get started. Hello, everybody. My name is Sohail Hussain. I'm a policy analyst with the Center for Transportation. is a nonprofit independent think tank that shapes public debate on multimodal transportation issues. Welcome to our ongoing series of webinars. Today, we'll be looking at transit history and lessons that we can take from transit history. From the early days of the streetcar to the multimodal systems of today, transit history provides a window into our lives, a window into the housing, economic, racial, and planning policies that have created and divided communities. Transit policies have been shaped to create systems worthy of both praise and criticism. Today, we will hear from three panelists who have written works on transit history. First, we will hear from Nick Bloom. Bloom is a professor of urban policy and planning at Hunter College, and his book is titled The Great American Transit Disaster. Next, we'll hear from Jake Berman, who is a cartographer, artist, lawyer, and author of The Lost Subways of North America. And lastly, we will hear from Philip Plotch, who is the principal researcher at the Center for Transportation and author of the book The Last Subway. The panelists will each talk for about 5 minutes, and then we will take questions from you in the audience. Anytime during the webinar, you can type in questions in the Q&A chat box, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. You can support us by donating or becoming a member of and you can check out the link also in the chat box. Thank you again for joining, and with that, I will turn it over to Nicholas to get us started.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be part of this conversation. And John, can you forward one more slide or the one more? There, thank you. Perfect. Well, good afternoon. I'm Nicholas Bloom from Hunter College, and I'm going to give a little overview of one of 6 case studies in my new book, The Great American Transit Disaster. And the question that the book tries to answer is, why is the United States such an outlier in mass transit quality? And I don't mean in a good way. And the book dives into, through these case studies, the social, political, institutional, and economic context of transit operations that destroyed American transit quality in the 20th century. Next slide. And we're going to look at Baltimore. Baltimore is like a typical American unsubsidized private transit system. It was run until 1970 by a private operator. And what happened in Baltimore repeated itself with variation across the nation. Most American transit systems until the late 60s and 70s were private systems. Next slide. Like all cities, Baltimore's extensive private streetcar network in the early 20th century focused on densely populated central areas, which you see surrounded by red there, with a few key suburban lines. And the city itself had grown around transit. Next slide. The 1920s started the collapse of this urban streetcar-based model, both in crowded downtown and a shift to cars in these growing suburban areas. Next. In time, cars would replace a formerly good network, suburban network, in newly planned elite white suburbs of the time before World War II. And these suburbs were very well built for cars, even though they had initially built up around streetcar links. Next. And unfortunately, the standards of these elite suburbs, emphasizing single-family zoning, no mixed uses, and so forth, went citywide in the 1920s in cities like Baltimore and everywhere else. And then in the 30s, redlining affirmed lower density areas, all white usually, while undermining capital for the transit-rich areas, which you see in the center. Or on the right is the redlining map. You see the red areas. Those are your transit-rich areas. Those were redlined. And that meant, what this meant in combination, the new citywide single-family zoning and the redlining of transit-rich areas meant that further investment by a private transit company, either both in central city areas and in new suburban areas, was not going to pay off well. Next. During the interwar years and World War II, Baltimore's racial population changed. It became, there was a very quick rise in the Black population, particularly in transit-rich areas, leading to integrated transit. But this made many white riders very uncomfortable. Next slide. And post-war in particular, but even before the war, whites began moving further out within the city itself and to the suburbs, and they bought cars. And white city car ownership grew very rapidly post-war. And this growth, both in the outer areas of the city and the suburbs, was enabled by lax land development controls in cities and suburbs. Next. Now, this was compounded by a series of bad choices, I would call them, from transit perspective by city leaders. They made many anti-transit decisions. They supported very strongly streetcar replacement. Baltimore was a city with a national city line operator who took over the Baltimore Transit Company, and they were all in for, streetcar replacement, but they had plenty of help by city officials. They rejected public ownership. City officials rejected until 1970, and state leaders too. They did not provide public subsidies to a failing private company, and they even taxed transit for a long time. Next slide. They also, compounding the problem, was they built city leaders, state leaders, and then of course federal money too. They built a transportation network faster than the transit system. That is the highway networks. And not only were those systems faster, but as you see on the lower right-hand side, they also disturbed many of the African-American central city neighborhoods that were still transit-oriented. Next. The failure also, the city leaders also targeted transit-rich areas with destructive policies of urban redevelopment, leading to rider displacement and lower density development. And you can see that here. Again, you see the areas red, which were redlined. Then those areas were subsequently also targeted for demolition, redevelopment as low density public housing and other redevelopment projects. Next. And then they failed, city, state, and federal leaders failed to basically stabilize these neighborhoods, leading to rider displacement and lower density development. In the long term as well, what we see is a decentralization also of the African American population away from the transit-rich areas. That's what you can see in the two maps on the right there, where the African American population also leaves the transit-rich areas to more car-dependent suburbs and so forth. Next. These combined factors destroyed the Baltimore Transit Company. While it's true that it was all in on buses, it was a national city line run entity after the 40s, but it generally tried to run a profitable public service, but it just couldn't do that. It didn't have wiggle room. And so what did they do? Of course, streetcar substitution is a cost-saving measure, rapid fare increases, rapid bus service reduction, deferred maintenance, and very limited expansion or modernization. Next. And then when finally the state took over transit in Baltimore in 1970, the public ownership model, it spent a lot of money on a suburban-focused rapid rail and later a light rail system that did not address the needs of most bus riders, and ultimately built only one, you see in green there, one rapid line, and then the blue line are the light rail lines, neither of which really did much for your core riders. So they made a management mistake here, but I would say this was conditioned by the typical regional political bargain of basically cities and anti-transit suburbs in regional transit agencies. Next. The results of these choices is reflected in part on these maps of ridership. So the 1960 map that you see there with ridership plotted on the map of Baltimore shows again those dense urban areas, those central areas, which used to be the transit-rich, by 1960 increasingly African-American neighborhoods. And I should say the 1960 map already showed they'd already lost more than half of the ridership by that point. But you see that even further losses were experienced, let's say by 2000, in those central areas because of the disinvestment, the failure to prioritize the current riders, and the long-term political and social context in which transit operated. So if this sort of story, if this way of thinking about transit is useful to you, thinking beyond the agencies and in thinking about how transit agencies have been forced to operate particularly in declining cities like Baltimore, then you'll find my book very interesting. So I would encourage you to pick up that, and you can read other case studies which show variations on a theme. Because what happened in Baltimore was pretty typical nationally in terms of the collapse of these private companies in the face of major demographic headwinds.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. And now I'll pass it over to Jake.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jake Berman, and I wrote The Lost Subways of North America. Nick really went over the details of the eras of transport, and so I'm going to use my time to add to this the discussions of the types of land use policies that made transit work and now, well, don't work. So to go back to the streetcar era, you have relatively loose land use regulation and pretty organic development patterns, and there was an assumption that development would follow the infrastructure. So the value of the land would broadly reflect how much development would take place there. And if you take the A train in New York City, that's what you see. If you get on the train at the World Trade Center, Chambers Street, you can see it's surrounded by high rises. 4 miles outbound at Nostrand Avenue, it's 4 to 6 story apartment buildings. Another 4 miles out at Euclid, you end up with 2 to 3 story townhouses. And by the time you reach the end of the line at Lefferts Boulevard, it's mostly single family, detached with off-street parking from the interwar period. So largely, if you build it, they will come. At the time, there was a sort of synergy between transport and land use in ways that would be very strange today. So on the one hand, it would be, say, electric companies like Seattle Electric or Georgia Power in Atlanta that were running the transit networks. And the other common synergy was for the transit company to be a real estate developer. So the Pacific Electric Railway in Los Angeles built all of the copy-paste suburbs, or many of them rather, that are named after the Huntington families. So Huntington Park, Huntington Beach, the Huntington Library, those were all built by the family that owned the Pacific Electric. Or in, say, Oakland, California, you have a company called the Realty Syndicate. Yes, it's called that. Running the local transit system and the interurban system that ran to San Francisco called the Key System. During this period, there's not a whole lot of planning per se, and the way that we would think of it now, and public approval is largely limited to elections. And if you didn't like the decisions that your elected representatives made, you voted the bums out. The result was that this produces the neighborhoods that everybody likes. So if you think of, say, Brookline, Mass., Silver Lake, Los Angeles, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, Brownstone, Brooklyn, those types of neighborhoods, they produce the neighborhoods that everybody loves. But it also had the related issues of, say, monopoly power, where you don't want the biggest real estate developer in your metropolitan area also controlling all of your transport. The other issue is that transit is used as a loss leader by many of these companies, and when the linkage gets broken between transit and other businesses, it becomes very hard to make the buses or the trains run on time. After World War II, everything changes, and land use becomes much more heavily regulated than in the interwar period, but it's still pretty loose. It's very easy to develop, especially in the suburbs, but even in the city, it was possible to build, which is how you get those types of boxy concrete towers in, say, downtown Los Angeles or in like inner ring suburbs like Brookline, Massachusetts. But what also accompanied that was the utopian desire to remake the city for the automobile and to get rid of poor people, minorities, and poor minorities. Unsurprisingly, there was a backlash against this era in the freeway revolts. So in Boston, for instance, the construction of the Massachusetts Turnpike through densely populated Newton and Brighton ultimately led Governor Frank Shriver to get rid of all new freeways inside of the Route 128 loop. To ban new freeways inside of the Route 128 inner loop, and it also led to the great environmental laws that were passed during the 1970s. The neighborhoods and the transit that were built during this era are generally not great, except for, with notable exceptions like Bethesda, Maryland, Silver Spring, Maryland, and Arlington, Virginia. And that's because there was a deliberate synergy in planning and the way that these places were designed to operate in concert with the new public transport, as opposed to the idea that people would just drive to the train station. Which brings us to the modern era of land use, which dates from about 1980 to the present, where all of the unintended consequences of the 1970s environmental reforms, like downzoning, like environmental clearance, and real prescriptive zoning rules about things like this, and race obviously played a role, means that old-style neighborhoods are largely frozen in place. Old-style neighborhoods are generally banned, like Somerville, Massachusetts, one of the inner ring suburbs of Boston, had only 3 legal buildings in the entire city that met the zoning rules. Coupled with this is the assumption that development is bad in and of itself. And the result of this is that you get the crisis that you have today, where job growth, especially in expensive coastal metropolises, vastly outpaces housing construction. Boston, you have 2.5 new jobs for every new unit built. LA, it's 5-to-1. San Francisco, it's 7-to-1. And very little of that ends up getting put near the public transport system. And so I want to close out, because I know that my time is running out, is that things were not always like this. Things were not always expensive, and the transit wasn't always bad, but it requires learning lessons from the past and how we did this in the old days.
Nice. Perfect. Just really quickly, I know there's a couple of comments in the question and answer. No, Jake did not have slides, so you guys are fine. And with that, I'll pass it on over to Phil.
Thanks, Sohail. I'm delighted to be here with Nick and Jake. I'm going to talk about one important lesson that comes up in my last Subway book. It's what can happen when you try to take on an ambitious project and you don't pay enough attention to the existing system. Next slide. So a little bit of background. This is Manhattan. In 1880, before there were any subways in New York, a private company built the 2nd Avenue elevated line on the east side of Manhattan. And it's amazing that this 8-mile line was built in less than a year and a half, less than 18 months. About 100 years ago, the city decided they were going to tear it down and build the 2nd Avenue subway line instead. Next slide. So in the Peanuts cartoon, every time Charlie Brown tries to kick the football, Lucy just pulls it away at the last second. And the 2nd Avenue subway is a little bit like that. Every decade for the past 100 years, something has gotten in the way. And I'm going to talk about a few of these decades. Next slide. So in the 1960s, this is New York's governor, Nelson Rockefeller, with the mayor and some other dignitaries. The governor had ambitions to be the US president. He also had ambitious transit expansion plans. And he set up an organization called the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA. And the MTA started to build 4 tunnel segments underneath 2nd Avenue. But the MTA woefully underestimated how much it was going to cost and their ability to pay for it. And New York had to abandon the construction of the 2nd Avenue subway, as well as some other projects that had been underway. Next slide. So on the left is one of those abandoned 2nd Avenue subway tunnels. Now, when a city focuses on building big, sexy transportation projects, it sometimes puts fewer resources into maintaining its existing system. And that's what happened in the 1970s. Everything started to deteriorate. Service did, stations, subway cars, maintenance facilities. Graffiti seemed to cover nearly every surface. When a subway car pulled into a station, about 1/3 of them had broken doors and broken lighting. And on average, there were 7 fires a day on the subway system. Around the year 2000, the stars started to align for the 2nd Avenue subway. There was political support, the population was growing, the economy was booming, and the MTA announced that they're resurrecting the 2nd Avenue subway, but this time they're going to build it in 4 separate stages. But again, they were overly optimistic on timing and cost and their ability to pay for it. Next slide. So in 2016, the governor announced that the first phase of the 2nd Avenue subway was going to open by the end of the year. And to meet that deadline, he forced the MTA to take people and to take resources that had been devoted to the existing system and move them over to the 2nd Avenue subway project. Now, when you don't have enough people inspecting and maintaining your existing tracks and all the equipment, it's going to come back to bite you. And that's exactly what happened. Next slide. So the MTA made the deadline. The governor was very happy. The first phase had opened up. He got national media coverage. Next slide. But within a few months, things started to go not where they were supposed to go. So there were these widely publicized derailments and delays on the existing system, and the media dubbed it the summer of hell. And the governor had to put the subway system into what he called the state of emergency. Next slide. So when you think about those abandoned subway tunnels that are still abandoned and that summer of hell, it's worth asking, are sexy projects worth it? Like the Second Avenue subway. Now, if you own a house, it might be tempting to build a new addition or redo your kitchen, but sometimes it's more important to fix your leaky roof and replace your furnace. Next slide. So New York City has lots of aging infrastructure on its subways, signals, power, its overhead structures. There's a picture of a control room. And when you don't upgrade these things, they're often more expensive to maintain, and they're more likely to cause problems and fail and lead to service problems. Next slide. So this is the last slide. And it's just that idea that transit agencies need to focus on projects that aren't very glamorous. So in New York, water flows into the subway from underground streams and from leaks and water main breaks. And on a typical day when it's not raining, the MTA pumps about 13 million gallons of water a day from its subways. Climate change is obviously going to make that a lot worse. And another problem is subway stations don't have enough exits and exhaust fans in case of an emergency. So that was my last slide, and I think it's a really important one. Thanks, Sohail.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much for that. So I'll get started with a few questions that I have for you guys. And it's kind of a big picture question, and that is, why do we study transit history? What is the point of studying transit history? Given that the context of yesterday is so different from today, are the lessons that we draw from our past, are they still relevant to today, and how can they be applied?
Well, I'll give a quick answer, which is that they're absolutely relevant. A lot of my book is about transit financing and the question of, who's to blame for transit loss. And what you'll find when you go into the history a lot of times is that local and state support was the missing link very often for transit quality. And while I do have 4 rather sad case studies look like Baltimore, Atlanta, and so forth. But there are cities like Boston, San Francisco, which have benefited from local and state funding, and those systems were able to maintain much more transit over time. So we can see, over 100-year period, that cities that are funded at a decent level, even when there's a crisis, they're the ones that are more resilient, and they basically keep more service in for the riders, and thus they keep more riders in place. So I do think that that's one quick answer. When we're facing a transit funding crisis, I should say, that's a big, so you got to fund it if you want to keep it around and have it as a utility.
So I mean, Nick, I agree with you. I also think that it's useful to have perspective on the way things used to be, because there's a lot of sentiment, especially within transit and transport planning community in the States, that there is something uniquely American that makes us bad at public transport, which is, I think that's a cop-out, right? It's assuming that this was handed down on Mount Sinai, and there are, magic that the Almighty has given us tablets saying, "Thou shalt have to drive to work." This happened for understandable reasons that made sense at the time, and understanding how things got so bad is a corollary to making them better.
And we built good lines here and there, right? I mean, that's the thing. Like, it's not that we can't build world-class transit. I mean, lines. I mean, DC is a classic example of a very beautiful system that, in terms of aesthetics and design in its time, was cutting edge. But, the larger context is what's holding, I would say, is what's sort of holding us back, whether it's the politics, the funding, like you, Jake, pointed out, the zoning. These are things that hold us back from being global leaders.
I want to put a plug in for something that Eno's been doing. So we have an Eno Transportation Weekly, which I highly recommend reading. And to honor the presidential election year, we're doing a series of 45 articles talking about each president and transportation. And what's really fascinating to me is that we think we live in this time of like rapid change and it's unprecedented. But if you go back over the course of 250 years or so, it's been nonstop. It's been from lighthouses to canals to trolleys to cable cars.
Mhm.
And I think it's really important to understand how each generation sort of navigates through that change. You know, how they accommodate that change, how they consider how to change their society or not change their society because of transportation. Because transportation changes the way we live and the way we work, and then we make those decisions about how we want to live, and then we make decisions about our transportation to accommodate our needs. So it's really, I think, useful to go back and see how we've done it in the past and what we can learn, what we did right, and clearly what we did wrong.
I mean, here's a classic example, Phil. I mean, Atlanta had a world-leading electric trolley car network, right? And Jake's also put this. I mean, that's that, in the decades and decades ago, right? So this was something where they made a great choice, right? They were like, where maybe the streetcars aren't perfect for us, but they chose this amazing technology, but they didn't sustain it. But there's some lessons there as well, right?
Yeah. And I think one of the questions that has come in recently is relating to growing and smaller cities that are growing. And my question there, I want to take that question and kind of amend it a little bit and ask, how can smaller cities, smaller agencies look to more established transit networks and the history of those established transit networks and take those lessons? Or is that something that is that good policy for smaller growing cities to take lessons from larger established transit agencies?
I think that one of the things that really needs to be learned by smaller cities is to, first and foremost, is the land use question, because if you were going to continue building outward with the same kinds of copy-paste suburbs that people have been building since 1945, it's going to be really hard to change the facts on the ground and get your transit to work well. The only place that I know of that's managed to do that is Houston, and Houston has an incredibly loose set of zoning and construction laws, which make it easier to adapt the city and to allow that kind of internal growth. Although, granted, Houston is still massively sprawling and continues to be so, but inside the innermost freeway loop of Houston, you do actually see that type of organic construction, but you need the kind of land use planning to work in synergy with the transit. It's not just a question of, well, how do we get the bus operations right?
Yeah, I would say also look at college towns. I mean, I don't know if looking at big cities is the right. There's some amazing bus systems, right, that college towns run, and what do they do right? And back to Jake's, I mean, land use is part of it. They're able to do more multifamily housing as dorms, right, something like that. But the quality of bus service that they're able to offer, the frequency, like those kinds of things, like the frequency of bus service and things like that, in a relatively small community, is a lot more, I think, meaningful than, for instance, looking for the rail line you would build or something. I think we're pretty much at that point, and thankfully now BRT has become a more typical approach. But we're at this sort of, I think, the end of a half century of building rail lines in anticipation of growth, where, as Jake has pointed out and many others, you're either not doing the land use right, or you don't have the demand, or you can't provide the service that would make people, the service quality in terms of frequency, that would make people use it. So I definitely think there are small cities that have done a pretty good job. They often are college towns with like high quality bus service. I would definitely encourage that.
I think Minneapolis is a really good example. They're pretty progressive on not constructing any more highways. And if you go to Minneapolis, you'll see that the baseball stadium and the basketball arena and the football field and the big shopping mall, the Mall of America, are all on a light rail line. And they're building BRT lines, so bus rapid transit lines on existing highways. And then they're sort of moving development along those BRT lines. So I think Minneapolis is a really good place. But when you mentioned what can smaller places learn, it reminded me when Washington, D.C. was building their subways. They went out to New York. They went to look at their subways. And they said, we want to know all the things that we shouldn't do So I want to make any of those decisions. See how New York City designed their stations and then do the opposite.
Interesting.
There is something to be said for what Montreal did in the 1960s, where Mayor Jean Drapeau went to Paris and London and New York and rode all the subways, and specifically said that he wanted the Parisian style of metro for everybody. So it's also important to look beyond your borders. And, Paris is just as far from New York City as San Francisco is by flight. So, take a thought of how other people do this.
Yeah, Jake, the other on that point, I mean, there are a lot of small cities in Europe that have unbelievable and very impressive, I mean, from an American standpoint, a ridership. And
Absolutely.
And it's a combination of like small cities with like trams. And I was in Switzerland last year. There were just so many trams going in like different cities. It was unbelievable. And you're like, well, must be a big city. It's a very small city, but everyone's using it. So I think it can be it can fit well with small cities.
I mean, one of the wonderful things I like to look at is the census data. And Dublin is the same size as Indianapolis. Madrid is the same size as Atlanta. European cities just tend to be smaller than both in population and geographical area than American ones. And like no one would say, wait, Dublin is really the same size as Indy? That's wild. But no, it's true. Like Dublin is smaller than Cleveland or, it's smaller than Detroit, but it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the other thing is a lot of Americans will go to Europe and they'll visit neighborhoods and so forth close in, the kind of neighborhoods that we knock down in the US. I mean, I think it would, had there not been that era of urban renewal and destruction and redlining and disinvestment, we would have more of that kind of in-town density that is only now starting to be rebuilt. And I think that really hurt a lot of our transit ridership in a way we don't talk about as much. We talk about urban renewal and the enormous costs it had to Black communities and other communities. But it also had an enormous effect on ridership, right? Because these were the neighborhoods in almost every American city that were the most densely populated and usually had the most legacy transit.
It does feel a little bit like to me at least, it feels a little bit like there was a hangover from the privately owned railway era, because so much of this political movement against new transit investment post-war really did come out of disgust with the private transit operators, Yeah. Like nobody was willing to go to bat for the Pacific Electric Railway.
No. For none of these companies, they were considered monopolists, right? And their view was, well, we're not getting the fare increases we want, or the zoning that helps us, all these sorts of things, and you're prioritizing cars. And so their view was, well, we'll disinvest in these things. So it was definitely a downward spiral, no question.
I want to shift the so this is kind of sort of not related in a way, but there's a really good question here that's asking about, have some of the most common political arguments against better funding public transit changed over the course of transit history? So, like among all of the other characteristics that have defined our transit history, funding seems to be something that I had not thought of before. So how in your opinions, how has that changed, or how has that changed over the course of transit history? How we fund it, or how we think about funding?
I think it goes back to where we just left off about these monopolies and these private companies. And we thought they had so much money, and there wasn't a thought that we should be putting public subsidies into it. It's like today thinking, oh, we should subsidize Google or we should subsidize Facebook because they're important to us. And we all rely upon Gmail and Google Maps. So we should be putting money into it. I think that's how people at first thought about subsidizing transit.
Yeah. And the few cities that did subsidy, like Boston or New York, were involved early, or San Francisco, they usually had a left-wing tradition of some sort. They had a more kind of, there was this idea of the worker needing a quality experience. In New York, for instance, the creation of the subway, which did involve government financing, was about decentralization, right? It was about, let's get the poor people out of the tenements. That was a big reason that they built the subways. a lot of the reformers was to decongest the city. And that's one reason it's a flat fare, right, to go out. So there was, in a few cities, there was a social equity proposition. But what finally, in most American cities in the 60s, which finally brought transit back in, were the downtown business interests, right? We talk about Chicago in the 40s and 50s when you have public ownership. There was that enormous fear, or New York in the 60s, right? The enormous land values in the center city brought out the property owners, right? Who said, okay, now that you've got to get involved. And so there was this kind of economic rationale, right? We've got to build and sustain the system to save downtown. There was a big downtown push in the 60s, and it really wasn't an equity proposition until very recently. I think the equity funding model is very new. Mostly it's been about a broader or a more narrow, I guess you say more narrow, kind of like center city real estate kind of proposition.
The irony is not lost on me that freeway construction, almost in the entire country, was premised on the same idea that we need to save downtown.
Yes.
Like in Detroit and Miami, there was so much freeway construction was meant to clear out minority neighborhoods so that downtown could expand. And it was an unintended consequence that it actually hollowed downtown out.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of those policies were counterintuitive or they had that effect because very often a lot of urban renewal policies focused on downtown shopping districts, which were often oriented around transit riders. And these were targeted very often for the kind of aggressive redevelopment policies. You can look at Baltimore, even in recent times, right? You look at the west side of downtown was a major transit-oriented shopping district. So what did city officials decide needed to happen? It's like, a major push on redevelopment that pushed out a lot of the small stores for chain stores and other kinds of redevelopment products, let's call them.
So it's interesting to see the federal government's role in funding for transit. So it wasn't really until the 60s or 70s where money started to flow, and it's for capital money for the most part. The pandemic was a really unusual period where the federal government said, we need to keep operating transit service. I'm going to continue that. It's being phased out. And that's now going to cause a problem for transit agencies that have been relying on it. And I think it's worth the federal government or Congress thinking again, is transit important? And if it's important, then it's going to need to provide some ongoing operating subsidies.
And certainly cities and states are going to have to figure, well, they are. We see that in New York and California and other places. And there have been moves to improve or stave off the worst cuts, which will come when the money runs out. So that's good as well. Because I'll tell you, my read of transit history is that there's often in transit advocacy circles like, well, the federal government should do this and, provide more. But in fact, if we look at the history of transit, the cities that have done better over the years in terms of funding, whether it's Boston, New York, or San Francisco, Seattle more recently, LA, they've had local and state aid that have really kind of, brought up the system or saved it. And that's a story you told too, Phil, with the MTA. So I do think we are in an era where there's an awareness of the importance of state and local operating support to keep transit going as well.
Yeah, I do think there needs to be a sort of grand bargain, though, in that funding there really needs to, especially in the Northeast, where you do have the kinds of staffing practices that make it extremely hard to run transit efficiently. So, one-man train operation in New York on the subways, one-man train operation on the Long Island Railroad, improving your operational practices so that you actually enforce your bus lanes, which means you can staff your buses better. Excuse me. And so that you can run your buses better, things like that, so you can get more operational efficiency is just as important as cutting a check.
Agreed.
Yeah. I think so. I
was going to say something else I think we could agree upon is the three of us see in some places like Chicago facing an imminent fiscal crisis in their transit system. There's so much we can learn from history because it's definitely not the first time Chicago is going through it. or some other transit agency is going through a financial crisis. And to look back and see what has been done in the past is really important.
And I'll tell you what we know for sure is if they don't bail out Chicago, the losses will be enormous in terms of ridership and service. And you don't come back easily from that. Riders, people very often, so like, you can't just sort of like raise and lower, right, service and not expect just massive ridership and permanent losses very often because people go out and like buy a car, So I think what also history tells us is, when you lose riders, you got to fight really hard to get them back. So it'd be much better to figure out a way to backstop a place like Chicago enough to figure out, like you're talking about the efficiencies and things like that. They are talking about regional reform of Chicago's mass transit to do that. But I'm telling you, it's interesting. You look back at a city like San Francisco in the 50s, there was a lot of criticism. They were running like empty buses, things like that, But, within a few years, it's like it came back. There was, ridership came back and they had very good density of ridership. And we even see that even today with San Francisco with the, massive downtown losses, but they still are hitting above their weight in terms of ridership.
In the couple of minutes we have left, I just want to ask one more question. And it was a question earlier about transit advocacy. And the question is, how has that changed over time? And what role does transit advocacy have in learning from our history and preserving our history moving it forward?
Well, I got to say, it's a golden age of transportation advocacy. From my point of view, I mean, you guys can decide if you agree, but I mean, it's pretty bleak. If you look historically, like it were a lot of top-down decisions. They didn't ever listen to riders. They ignored large African-American ridership bases in almost every city. I think we have almost every city has some kind of advocacy group now. I think we're really actually very well positioned compared to how things were, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. That's my view.
I'd say it's a little hard to generalize. Obviously, some cities are better than other cities, but I can tell you they can be really effective. They can change policies.
Mhm.
They can get more funding if they're well organized, and if they pound the pavement, hold rallies, and knock on legislators' doors. They can influence public policy in a really good way.
It's an exciting time in that way. And social media, I think, has actually been very useful in that. I think there's been a whole series of, YouTube educators and people can get their message out and so forth. I think, it really was the problem 70, 80 years ago, right, is you had the establishment, and the establishment was totally on the auto, whether in city or suburb, right? And they didn't listen to anybody. And, it was all this kind of very bottom line thinking of the private transit company, and like the city officials didn't want to be involved in it and whatever. And so they didn't listen to anyone. And that's how you end up losing everything. So I do think we've come a long way, and I think that's important.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of using the P word, the way to fix the problem is politics.
Yeah. It's a political thing. It's a political entity at this point. It's never going to fund itself in the U.S., so it's definitely a political entity.
I don't think every elected official understands that either, that all of the transit services in the United States are subsidized in one way or another. And I just think that's a really important message for people to remember.
I feel like we could keep going, but we are running out of time, unfortunately. I had a list of so many questions, and I could talk for hours about this. So I thank you all very, very much for participating, all the audience questions. I really appreciate all of your insights and participation. You'll be able to find a recording of this webinar on our website, enotrans.org, and a recording will be sent to via email to everyone who had registered. Feel free to sign up for our mailing list, where you can find out about upcoming webinars, gain access to Transportation Weekly, and much more. And definitely keep an eye out for any upcoming webinars coming up. And again, thank you all so much, Phil, Jake, and Nick, for your insights, audience for your participation. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.